In the music business, it's the business that keeps the music alive. Today, we don't have the nobility or the church supporting music in the way they did in the past. So how do musicians and their organizations survive? What is it really like in the music business? Let's find out through conversations with people who are actually part of the music business. I'm Roxanne Janson. Welcome to Music Business Artistry. Today, we are pleased to welcome Andrew Bales, the General Manager of Symphony Silicon Valley. Thank you, Andrew, for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So I have been around the symphony quite a bit, obviously. I've sung quite a bit with your symphony as well as with other music groups, but I haven't been a part of the symphony or the structure of the symphony, and I wanted to find out more about it. How do you keep this symphony going when many symphonies are going out of business today?
Well, as you know, Symphony Silicon Valley is the child of an environment that had a long history of classical music in the South Bay region, but that the core symphony there, the San Jose Symphony, went bankrupt. They were in business for 120 plus years, and they finally closed in the early part of the century. And we immediately founded Symphony Silicon Valley to come out and do it. But we did it recognizing that the financial pressures that were there had to be dealt with differently. And so we set up a new model, set up a new way to think about it.
Okay, so what is the new model? What's different from how the previous symphony was organized?
Well, most symphonies are based upon a model of collecting a relatively modest part of their revenue from the customers themselves. They look for substantial donations. So they're really in the business of patron development with the idea of how much they donate, not how much they buy tickets.
Okay.
So they don't think of the product as a commodity in quite the same way. We set about we certainly still need donations. Don't get me wrong, we're still out there. But we tried to reverse the polarity of that so that instead of about 30, 32, 33% earned, we said, let's go for 65% earned.
Okay.
And let's go out there and put a product out there that our customers will like, that's sort of market-driven, that pays attention to the appetite of the marketplace, and then charge a fair price for it.
So in other communities and other symphonies, what you're saying is the symphonies survive the way music survived in previous centuries by people donating money to the symphonies. And that's the bulk of where they got it. So in the past, it was the nobility and it was the, and it was the church, but then later it was the wealthy members of the community leaving legacy. And you don't depend entirely on legacy anymore.
We don't, but that's not true that many other symphonies don't still do that. The issue we face, the South Bay is an interesting marketplace.
Yes.
The South Bay region is a hyperinflated environment, and it pays people reasonably well. They have the discretionary income to pick their choices, to make decisions, to go to things. When we started the new symphony, the average net ticket price was probably 45% higher than it had been for the previous one. And yet there was no resistance, no price resistance. Nobody said, oh my God, I'm not going to pay that amount of money.
Yeah.
Because the other was used to discounting to a point that they devalued the marketplace's sense of what it was worth. This sounds boring. I'm going to get over that fast.
No.
But we said, people's time is more important than money to most of them now.
Yeah.
And so you say, let's make sure what we give them is an extremely high value, a very high standard of performance, reaches into the breadth of the classical music field and gives them a range of things that are interesting and wonderful, but isn't afraid to do the classics, isn't afraid to put to look at the virtuosity of our art form. Sometimes the arts think creativity is their basis. And of course, there is a root of creativity in all of this. But we've acquired quite a canon. We've got a wonderful repertoire. So why don't we milk that a little bit? Why don't we go out there and don't be afraid to do Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart, or Bernstein or Copland or many others. Because what happens is people hearing it live and hearing it with a high quality performance. That virtuosity is really our stock in trade.
So one thing that I've always wondered about is how you find the musicians. So if I wanted to run an orchestra, run a symphony, which I don't, just so you know, I think you're doing a great job. I'll stand back and watch. How do you find the musicians?
Well, conservatories are churning them out left and right. That's unfortunate for them, but fortunate for groups like ours. The real process is an audition process. We do blind auditions. We audition all the musicians for the orchestra behind a screen, so there's no bias that can come into play. You are entirely basing it on the quality of the music they present to you on that given day. So any given day. The dilemma is that sometimes some very fine musicians can just have a bad day.
Yes.
And we've all known musicians who said, I would love to have that person in my orchestra, but on the day we auditioned, it wasn't their finest day and somebody else had a great day. But the fact that somebody else had a great day means maybe they'll have another, and so we're not unhappy with the process. We audition them. Many of our musicians, sitting musicians, help decide who will be their new colleagues.
Okay.
So they sit there and listen, and they evaluate who is going to come next into the orchestra.
So as the general manager, you don't have to make every decision yourself.
No, that's correct. I don't. In fact, there's several steps in the process of adjudicating the leadership and management of the organization that I'm involved in. But I attend all the auditions, but I never vote on any auditions.
Okay.
I leave that 100% to the musicians.
Good. So one other thing that you do differently than a lot of symphonies is you don't have a regular conductor.
No, we literally sat there, and I literally sat there and said, okay, when we want to start this symphony, what is the resource from the former symphony that we most want to gather in? And it was the virtuosity of those musicians. It was the people who'd made a choice to live here in a very expensive marketplace, who had made a decision to be here, to play these instruments, to train and be excellent at it, and were committed to being here and being part of it. And so we made that choice. Financially, we were a startup venture at this point, so we said, well, I'm not really ready to make a decision about who would be the singular musical leader and a music director, conductor. I used to laugh and tell people, you know, you can't, if you catch a young up-and-comer doing well, you can't keep them very long. They're going to move on to a bigger opportunity, particularly when we started out. Because when we started out, like any startup, there wasn't very much activity. You know, we did 4 concerts our first year and 6 the second.
How many do you do now?
Well, now we actually count them in services. We're now at about 80 or 90 services a year now for the musicians. That's not all performances. Some of them are other kinds of things, but it's we are now, in terms of service load, I think we're either number 1 or number 2 every year in the largest number of services offered in Northern California for what's called a per-service orchestra. Now, little city to the north, San Francisco, has this little band that people think pretty highly of.
Yes.
And I must admit, I go and attend and enjoy. That's not considered a per-service orchestra. That's an annual contract. It's a different kind of relationship with their musicians.
Okay.
But
so that leads us to what is your contract with your musicians? Do you have unions?
Yeah.
How do you
Fully
do this?
unionized business. We have many unions. Our musicians are union members. When I started the symphony, you know, I'm fencing around it. I was the founder of the symphony, so it's not we, it's I in this particular case. But when I started the symphony, I voluntarily agreed to use the AFM, American Federation of Musicians, as their representative. It would have been naive to try and do otherwise, but I believe in the unions. I believe that they're a way to level the playing field. You take a look at your resources, and if you have to negotiate with 80 individuals to get a wage rate or a base, or each one at a time, that may seem fair in a meritocracy, but we're about a group experience.
Yeah.
So we don't go that way. We're unions in other ways as well, the stagehands and the ushers and many places. But the musicians, by coming in together as a group, by being part of the union, They then bargain hard to get what they can get, and we try to give them all that we can, and we find a nice middle ground, and then everyone comes to work, and they're not bargaining, oh, I wish I could have gotten $5 more. Well,
Yeah.
you collectively got what you got.
Okay. So we've talked about the musicians and the union and all, and how is the symphony itself structured? You have the musicians, there's obviously you.
Yeah.
So you have the musicians, you have a staff.
Yeah.
And then you have a board?
The structure of our organizations, we have a board of trustees, of course. We are a public benefit corporation, like so many. And we rely upon the donations of our patrons, but we also rely upon the earned income of selling tickets and doing programs that'll serve people. I act as the general director. As general director, I'm sort of that amalgam of both the business side and the artistic side. The musicians are the product, but to that product you have to add the kind of leadership. I provide a certain degree of leadership, but the conductors who stand on the podium are integral to that.
So how do you find those conductors?
You know, one of the things that I think has been a great bonus to us, and we are unique, there aren't really a lot of other symphonies that do this in this country, there are more in Europe. We're entirely based around a guest conductor proposition. So we bring in, no one conductor has the podium year-round. That means that if I want to do Brahms, I go find the best conductor I can find who thinks Brahms is the best thing in the world. And if I want to do a contemporary work, then I go find somebody who does that as well. It allows us to give a wider range of repertoire done at a higher standard. I mean, one of the things that, when I started out, I asked conductors, a group of conductors, to propose programs. Well, they all assumed that maybe I was in a early stages of a search process, and so maybe they better put a program together that would be a good audition piece for them.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening is I ended up getting the same program from all of them.
Yeah.
Now, not identical, but there were certain big blockbuster repertory pieces that they would all do, and there were certain
Beethoven's
concertos.
Ninth or something.
Yes, or the you know, or there's a whole Dvorak. There's Elgar. There's the planets. I mean, there's a handful of things that came up, and everybody showed up with it. We're going to do this one, and you realize, well, that's okay. Each one of those programs is wonderful, but a whole season of them is tedious and boring, and it's not at all adventurous in the way you wanted it to be. So very early on, I learned that I needed to direct the conductors down a path that gave a balance to the season.
Okay.
So what this all leads to, and I've taken too long to get to it, the orchestra is structured around a balanced program. The musicians are there to play all kinds of music to excite them and make them want to be a part of it. And so we go find the conductors that'll fit that. Now, if we brought in a new conductor every time, there's a getting to know you stage. You'd be very wasteful of the rehearsal time. And so we don't do that. We bring in 1 or 2 new conductors a year, but the rest of them are people we bring back. So if we have somebody who we find great in contemporary repertoire and we want to do a contemporary program next year, then likely that candidate will come back again if he's met the mettle of the musicians, if they find him interesting.
And so how do you know if that conductor has met the mettle of the musicians?
Well, what we go about is there's 2 levels of evaluation. One, there is a survey that the musicians themselves conduct of each other, in which they evaluate the conductor on a whole series of criteria. And that is, in the immediacy of doing that performance, they fill out this survey and said, I loved what he did, I liked his stick technique, I loved the choice of music, I hated his choice of music, I think he didn't know what he was talking about, I didn't like the comment he made in the 3rd row, you know, all of those kinds of things.
He forgot to give cues.
He forgot to give the cues, his cues were unclear. So you get all of that kind of range. Again, I love him, I hate him. And that's scored on a survey basis.
Okay.
Then at the end of the year, you have an artistic committee. Now, the artistic committee are elected members of the orchestra that they choose. These are the leaders, the thought leaders
about
within the orchestra.
3 or 10?
There's
or
5 people there.
5 people, okay.
Concertmaster is always one. That's a principal violin.
Mm-hmm.
But then others are elected. And then they come together, and instead of looking at each conductor in the immediacy of a single program, they look at the breadth of conductors we want for a season and say, well, this is good for that, this is good, this person would be good doing the Mozart, this person would be good doing the Rachmaninoff and the Russians, this one's great in the French. We've got a great gentleman who does Latin American music for us a great deal. You had the occasion to sing with him when we did Carmina Burana a few years ago.
Yes, and
Carlos
I've only
Vieux.
not, yes, yes.
Carlos Vieux was great. So what happens is that artistic committee is not so focused on what they felt at one point in time, but what was the feeling across a breadth of time.
Okay.
Because sometimes a bad weekend doesn't mean a bad conductor.
Right.
A bad weekend is just a weekend. It's one time.
Remember that about your singers, too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. No, and so you have to make your decisions across a span. So the artistic committee expands that vision.
Yes.
Goes out and is talking about it in a longer view. And with them, I select we collectively select who will be the conductors.
So I want to interrupt and ask.
Sure.
So from a complete novice point of view, that's after you've asked the conductors to submit work, and so you already know, you're searching from a pool. But how do you get that pool in the first place? Do you just announce in the newspaper? Do you announce in the...
No. Conductors, musicians bring names to me. Agents are calling constantly with names of conductors. There's any number of ways that you come in contact with them. You hear about a performance. I go and attend other people's performances and say, oh, that's kind of interesting. Let's see, would that be a good fit here or not?
Yeah, so see, if I did that, I would still have a very narrow scope, because I tend to go to a limited number of concerts, for one thing, and then again, the ones that I can afford. And sometimes those are not necessarily the best conductors in the world, but sometimes they are.
Well, for the most part, I'm not bringing conductors who are uniquely local. So it's usually much more about the influence across the span of things. You sort of listen to advice from a lot of sources, and you look around and you look at repertory and who's gotten a great review lately and who's done this and who's done that. Sometimes you catch them at the right time, sometimes you catch them too late. Dudamel, who is a superstar in our business, was hardly known when we started, and in fact I saw him and I said, this is a pretty talented young man. Let's see what happens. Well, by the time I'd seen what had happened, he was gone beyond us.
Yes.
He was blowing the world away.
That happens.
And it's exciting. It's exciting.
So how is the programming chosen? Who decides what music will be performed over the course of the year, or over the course of the next 5 years or 20 years?
The buck stops with me. I ultimately am the one who
so if you haven't done an Alexander Nevsky like I want, I blame you.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And what happens is, but I'm influenced by lots and lots of people. I'm influenced. Our last program we did a Cacciatorian violin concerto. I had people asking me for Cacciatorian just as you just did for the Nevsky. Since we started. And it was just a question of, well, when and how and what was the right mix and
you gotta get
what program did it fit into.
Yeah.
One of the things that I do, I work late at night a lot on lots of things. You work all day in response to people, then they go home and you get to actually sit down and proactively think about what comes next. And I'd love to do that. But one of the things I do is I listen to music. And so I have a huge library of music. And I'll sit there and I'll play a program and I'll play it once and again and the third time. And if by the time the third time's through, I'm already starting to wonder if that piece fits with the other one, then I make changes. I say, I don't want a program that I don't feel is fulfilling and satisfying throughout. It doesn't all have to be the same. It can be different. It can break it up. It can do all kinds of things. But ultimately, you want a mix of programs that says, we have a wonderful canon. We have a wonderful heritage of music. New pieces are coming along. Where do you fit them in? What do you do with them? And how they fit together is always hard.
So tell us a little bit, you've told us a little bit about the organization and the structure. So you have the musicians, you have the conductors, you have your staff, and you have a board.
Correct.
Did I understand you right that you have 2 boards? You have...
No, well, we have a single board of directors. We have an advisory board for our chorale.
Okay, okay. I misunderstood.
Yeah,
okay,
no,
that's why I was saying
we have
the 2 different chords.
multiple. We have multiple pieces of our business. One of the things that happened when the San Jose Symphony closed, I like to say that once upon a time in America, a city was distinguished from being a town because it had a architecturally significant city hall, it had what we used to call a Carnegie Library, and it had a symphony orchestra.
Yeah.
These were defining characteristics of a city from a town. Now, that's long since not really true anymore. There are lots of things that go into it, but we are a very diverse world, and our communities are all very diverse. And the symphony is no longer the single dominant player on the scene. It may be the biggest one, but it's in a wide mix of artistic influence. So we play to a niche market.
Yeah.
Well, but that niche market is pretty wide. And so in the classical music realm, the core classics does play to a particular audience with a particular wealth capacity that helps us fund it and keeps it alive and going. But those same musicians are most capable of doing things like the Star Wars themes.
Yes.
Or the Lord of the Rings, or the
And
Harry
that
Potters,
brings
and
in a
those kind of
different
things.
audience, too.
Absolutely. And so the musicians have a great range and can cross that niche, can expand beyond that niche.
So I'm going to interrupt you
Sure.
so I can be sure to get in here. I never asked you what your background is. How did you feel that you had the expertise or the guts to start a symphony?
My own background is I've been in theater and dance all of my adult life. Went to Berkeley and got my degree in theater and moved off to New York and toured the world with dance companies and stayed in that area and came back to the South Bay as president of Cleveland Ballet, where we formed a co-venture that was San Jose Cleveland. This is 30 years ago now.
Okay.
And I've done other things since then. We needed the live musicians for the ballet that I was running at the time. And when the symphony closed, I said, well, let's put the two together. Let's merge the two. Let's take over and run a symphony and an orchestra in one organization. The idea of a co-venture was not new to me. We'd done it between Cleveland and San Jose. There we did one art form in 2 cities, and he said one city and 2 art forms. That didn't prove to be a great fit.
No.
It conceptually was a great fit. It was a great idea, but it didn't prove to be a great fit because the co-venture between Cleveland and San Jose had just broken up as the San Jose Symphony went bankrupt. They all happened within 2 years of each other.
Right, so you had to start something from...
So too many things were starting at the
changing.
same time and changing at the same time. Says, okay, we're not ready to do that.
So I'm going to interrupt and ask,
Yeah.
now that you've gotten started in this, and it's been going for many years now, we have just a minute or so left. Can you tell us where you're going in the future and how you're going to make sure it's going to survive?
Well, you know, that is something we're very much actively working on. We're looking on the planning for the succession. You know, my succession when I decide to retire, when our board's leadership changes, how do you bring new board members on? Musicians. Many of these musicians have been in the major orchestra in this town for 30 and 40 years. They will start to retire in their own way and are retiring, but also audiences. I mean, we talk about doing things like the Harry Potter series, because it's not that a Harry Potter buyer is going to buy Mozart next week, but that if they've had an experience with a live orchestra that is so thrilling as it is in those movies, and people love them, they go crazy for them. I do too.
Yes.
We'll find that they won't feel so intimidated to cross the line when they're ready to do that. So, you know, we're always thinking about how to make it sustain, how to go forward. But it's an ephemeral art form.
Okay.
Every night's performance is the one that counts.
And I think that's a good way to end it, that every night's performance is the one that counts. Well, I
Thank
hope
you.
we can have you back again one day, and I can plague you with more questions about how to run a symphony. But today, I want to thank you all for joining us again on Music Business Artistry, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Good.
Now we can just
Now we can